Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are analyzing a concept that's, well, really shifted from just academic theory into a major feature of geopolitics, the civilizational state, or CS. Okay, let's unpack this. For, maybe 2 centuries, the Western nation-state model seemed like the endgame, right? Fixed borders, certain democratic setups, often one national identity. That was seen as the final stage. But this civilizational state idea, which really took shape in Chinese thought, it offers a totally different path, and it's exploded beyond journals. It's now really central to how big non-Western powers like China, Russia, and India talk about themselves. So our mission today is to really get under the hood. What's the definition, where'd it come from, and crucially, why has its adoption made the West go from, well, kind of laughing it off initially to seeing it as this profound challenge?
And that shift, that's really the heart of it, isn't it? What's so fascinating is how directly this concept pushes back against those long-held Western ideas about what a modern state even is. It's like an intellectual countermove. It basically says, look, we don't need to copy your 18th century European model. We have our own path based on millennia of continuous history. And they argue this provides a stronger, more culturally authentic way to govern today. It's a really different vision for development, linking today's political legitimacy directly to that deep past.
Right. So let's start where the modern concept really got its footing, China. The term, as it's used now, came up around 2010 from thinkers like Zhang Weiwei. And the core idea is this complete fusion, a really long-standing, uninterrupted ancient civilization. We're talking thousands of years with a modern, huge state machine.
And that specific wording, that fusion, it's very deliberate. It's a direct answer to some earlier kind of dismissive Western views. Our sources point out that the term civilizational state was picked specifically to counter people like Lu Xunpai, who basically suggested China was just this old civilization, kind of clumsily pretending to be a modern state. By saying the civilization is the operating system of the modern state, they completely flip that. They argue that this incredible depth of history and culture isn't a problem for modernization. It's actually the source of a unique kind of stability and effectiveness, something nation-states just can't replicate.
Okay, so it's not just bragging about ancient history. It's a political argument. And when they talk about the Chinese CS model, they use these 4 massive characteristics, the 4 supers, they call them.
Yeah, the 4 supers.
These are things they say make the standard nation-state model just too small, too limited to explain China. So the 4 are, first, a super large population. Second, super vast territory. Third, a super long historical tradition. And fourth, a super rich cultural heritage. Listing them is one thing, but what do these supers do politically? What are the implications?
That's the critical link, isn't it, between the theory and, actual policy. If you think about the nation state, the goal is often making things uniform within those set borders, homogeneity. But the 4 supers, they argue, demand a totally different approach to governing. Take the super long historical tradition. Proponents say this history gives them a kind of proven resilience. And crucially, it lets them define legitimacy differently, not just by the last election, but by long-term stability and, performance.
It's like a historical mandate.
Exactly, a historical mandate to govern effectively. And that allows for planning way out into the future, decades ahead, something short democratic cycles often struggle with.
And the huge population and territory, what do they bring to the political table?
Well, complexity, basically, and global weight. Managing a territory that big with that many people requires a really strong central system. Think massive infrastructure projects, controlling huge regional differences, keeping everything stable. Proponents argue this justifies, even necessitates, a unique, very centralized political structure, one that puts discipline and consensus maybe ahead of the individual rights focus you see in smaller, perhaps more manageable nation-states. So each super is both describing the scale and justifying why their politics are different. And once this big idea was really solidified in Beijing, the rest of the world had to start paying attention. Connecting this to the bigger picture, you see the CS discussion is definitely not just academic anymore. It's been taken seriously at big events, like the Monk Dialogue, discussed heavily in U.S. think tanks. That signals real high-level concern now.
Yeah, the sources really suggest that the way this discourse quietly built up, first in China, then Russia, is now seen as actively, undermining the Western-led liberal order. That's a huge change from how it started. I thought the initial Western reaction you mentioned was really telling. When the idea first popped up, our sources show it was often met with this sort of, condescending amusement.
Dismiss.
Yeah, like that 2012 UK Observer headline you found. The white man's burden. The world's oldest civilization is preparing to start schooling the West. just dripping with sarcasm.
That really reflected the deep confidence back then that the nation-state was the only way to be modern. The West genuinely thought China, or anyone else with a deep history, would eventually have to become like them politically to truly succeed. But that laughter has definitely stopped. Now you see real alarm in places like The Economist, The New York Times. Why? Because the CS model seems to offer a way to be modern and successful without becoming Western.
And that alternative path relies on this really key shift in narrative, which we need to be clear about. Moving the goalposts for legitimacy away from simply democracy versus autocracy.
Exactly. They're trying to change the conversation to good governance versus bad governance. And this focus on effectiveness, it isn't just pulled out of thin air. It's tied to their own long cultural traditions, like Chinese imperial ideas of meritocracy, capable bureaucracy, competence. Exactly. They define good governance by results you can see. Lifting people out of poverty, stability, managing all that complexity effectively, having institutions that actually work. The argument is basically, the Western system focuses too much on the process, the institutional design, the elections, while the civilizational state prioritizes performance and long-term social health, using its own unique history as the measuring stick, not Western democratic benchmarks.
And because they seem to be making this shift work, providing a non-Western standard, that's why we see this really important trend now. That the term isn't just China's anymore.
Right.
Other major non-Western countries are picking it up. Russia, India, Turkey, Iran.
And the common thread there seems pretty clear. It's a shared, deep rejection of what they see as Western meddling and, frankly, lectures about how they should run their own countries. The message is basically, we're unique, we have our own history, our own legitimacy, respect us, and maybe focus on your own problems. It's an assertion of dignity, really, rooted in that civilizational identity.
Let's look at Russia's case. It's probably the most developed example after China, theoretically speaking. President Putin started using the term way back in 2013, making it official. Russia's definition seems to focus on things that bind the Russian world together, the language, the unique culture, Orthodox Christianity playing a big role, along with other traditional faiths.
And the theory behind it is crucial: Eurasianism. This idea emphasizes Russia's unique position, straddling Europe and Asia, making it a distinct civilization in itself. But the philosophy of Eurasianism is where it gets really interesting as a challenge to the West. Eurasianism offers a strong critique of liberal theory, specifically targeting what it calls the dehumanized individual. It's a dense concept, but the basic idea is that the Western liberal focus on extreme individualism breaks society apart.
How so?
Well, they argue it disconnects the individual from essential things like community, family, tradition, the state itself turning people into just isolated economic units or bundles of rights.
Okay, so the nation-state model emphasizes the individual, who connects to the state mainly through rights, contracts, voting.
Pretty much. Eurasianism says that approach, that dehumanized individual, leads to social instability and cultural weakness. Their view instead is that humans are inherently tied to these bigger historical things: family, community, state, morality. So the civilizational state framework becomes the justification for a more collective political structure needed, they say, to keep society stable, connected, and rooted in its historical identity. It's a fundamental philosophical difference driving their politics and their rejection of Western norms.
Then there's India, which is fascinating because it's a democracy using this term, but facing different issues. Prime Minister Modi, other officials, they've used it, often starting with a Hindu-centric civilizational narrative, but sometimes broadening it out, like talking about India's role in spreading Buddhism. But as our sources point out, India's situation is really complex internally. How do they square the circle? How do they claim this deep civilizational unity when historically they haven't had the same kind of continuous political unity China has?
Yeah, that's the key distinction. Indian scholars themselves acknowledge they don't have that single, unbroken line of political structure like the Chinese imperial state, which carried on even when dynasties fell. So India's version has to lean much more heavily on cultural or civilizational unity, the shared philosophies, the ancient traditions, the historical narratives that cross different regions and languages rather than political continuity.
So it's more about shared culture than a shared state history.
Exactly. That's why their discourse emphasizes the deep cultural roots that spread across a very diverse country. But it's a huge challenge because, as you said, they constantly face internal political, religious, and linguistic tensions that test that very idea of unity.
So, comparing them, Russia's CS narrative, based on Eurasianism, seems more theoretically solid, more systematic maybe, While India's is still kind of being built, navigating internal diversity while using the concept for national pride and international standing.
That sounds about right. But the common element for both and others is definitely finding a non-Western source for their legitimacy and their place in the world, even if how they apply it politically looks quite different on the ground.
And the power of this whole idea is now making waves even within the West itself.
Yeah.
You mentioned French President Macron. In 2020, he said something pretty startling to his ambassadors. He suggested China, Russia, and India as true civilizational states actually had more political inspiration and a more logical approach to the world than modern Europe. He even talked about wanting to shape the EU into a kind of civilizational community.
Yeah.
Which is odd, right? If the CS concept is fundamentally framed against the West, why is it finding these unexpected admirers, even on opposite sides of the political aisle in Europe and the US?
It is strange, but it speaks to a widespread dissatisfaction with the current liberal global system. The concept seems to resonate across a political spectrum for different reasons. For some on the political left in the West, the CS model can look like a positive thing, self-assertion based on local indigenous culture. They might see it as a valid pushback against globalized liberal capitalism, which they often see as a form of Western imperialism that flattens unique cultures.
Okay, so a defense of local culture against global forces. What about the right wing? They're often suspicious of these rising powers, yet the CS idea seems to appeal to them too.
Well, for many on the right, the appeal is different but just as strong. They often connect liberalism and excessive individualism with what they see as cultural decay, moral drift, and problems related to immigration. So, the civilizational state narrative, with its emphasis on tradition, historical continuity, discipline, and cultural cohesion, looks like an attractive model for resisting that perceived decline. It seems to affirm a strong, defined national identity, something many conservatives feel is being lost in the West. It validates collective identity and traditional structures.
Interesting how it can appeal to both sides for opposite reasons. But ultimately, the core intellectual goal seems the same, no matter who's using the term.
Exactly.
The civilizational state model is fundamentally trying to shift the conversation back to local, historically rooted ways of defining legitimacy. It's pushing back against that unspoken assumption that the Western model is the only way, the inevitable endpoint.
It's a major intellectual undertaking. It's about setting up a non-Western standard, a different yardstick for judging political progress, performance, legitimacy. It gives these powers a framework to act based on their own history without constantly looking for Western approval.
So for you, listening at home, the key takeaway really is this. The civilizational state isn't some dusty historical curiosity. It's a very modern, very strategic idea. It's a vital lens for understanding how major non-Western powers see themselves, how they justify their political systems both at home and abroad, and why they are, collectively, pushing back against being told how to run their societies by the rest. It's almost like their intellectual declaration of independence.
And that leads directly to the final thought we wanted to leave you mulling over. If this CS concept keeps spreading, with major world players all adopting it even with their different flavors, it strongly suggests we're moving deeper into a multipolar, multi-civilizational world, which raises a huge question. In a world where every major power claims its own unique civilizational exceptionalism, essentially saying, our history makes our political system uniquely legitimate and maybe superior, what happens then? What new rules for diplomacy, for handling conflict, for just coexisting will we need when the old nation-state rulebook doesn't seem to fit everyone anymore? How do you ensure stability when everyone claims to be exceptional?
That is a seriously big question about where international relations might be heading. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the civilizational state. We hope you feel well equipped now to understand this crucial and evolving global narrative.